If we're going back to January 1994, take us through that day.
Oh my gosh. For me. Well, I was living in beautiful Canyon Country, and we weren't hit as bad out in Canyon Country, but I remember at McQuaid, it wasn't my house. It was 4:30 in the morning, and I went back to sleep. An hour later, there was this banging on the door, and it's Lynn Harris, who's the director of community development at the time. And she's like, "You got to go down to City Hall. I'm taking you down there right now." And as we're driving down to City Hall, I had no idea. It looked like we'd been hit by a bomb. There were fires everywhere, down power poles, down walls everywhere. I had no idea. And I didn't see my house for another 2 weeks after that, so pretty much lived at City Hall. But that was that day. That was day one for me.
And you were the first communications person the city ever hired.
I was hired in 1990. It's 2.5 years after cityhood. Started the communications program, built it from the ground up. There was nothing there for communications. And you got to remember, this was before social media, before computers were huge. Actually, my first year or so, I was on an IBM Selectric typewriter when I started with the city, banging out press releases and what have you. So yeah, I was the very first.
And it was before the internet too.
Before the internet, before social media, yes.
So you get to City Hall.
Oh my gosh. It was all hands on deck. At that point, City Hall had not been declared a red tagged building. At that point, we were able to work out of City Hall. So we were in the City Council chambers, which was our designated emergency operations center. Let me also point out that one of the great things about the city of Santa Clarita is we had people at the helm that, for whatever reason, were very big on emergency preparation. And before this time, before January 1994, we had received extensive training in emergency response, crisis management, emergency management from the state and the federal level. We had many what they call tabletop exercises, giving us various scenarios of disasters, fires, what have you. And we had practiced, and so this was not a foreign thing for us to open up our emergency operations center, have people at their designated stations at their jobs. The difference is that we had a lot of people that were impacted in their own homes with their own families by the earthquake, and they literally would, including the city manager, left their homes to report to City Hall to take care of the city.
And if you recall, the city coordinated a fake earthquake at Magic Mountain back in November. Before that, there was, I think, like an 8.6, with Magic Mountain being the epicenter and the point of everything there. And one funny story is, back then, satellite phones were just coming out and very, very expensive. Mm-hmm. Henry Mayo had bought a whole series of satellite phones, and they were so expensive they kept it locked up in the industrial center and had a point person, for should an emergency happen, be there to distribute it to all the department heads. And that went off flawlessly during the fake drill. They handed out, everyone goes back to their places, and no one had given phone numbers. No phone numbers.
Oh dear. Oh boy.
The moral of the story is practice makes perfect.
Practice
so
makes
real
perfect.
Thing happened.
Yeah.
Actually had phone numbers.
Yeah, that's funny. I do remember those giant phones, and for whatever reason, they didn't hold a charge. And so we had these giant brick things that were phones, and they just needed charging like every 4 or 5 hours. It was very painful.
Community.
Could I interject on that one? Sure. Do you actually know the story that Carl just told? Right? Could I be the one to recount that story on there?
I don't remember enough of it. I remember as he was saying it, I remember bits and pieces of it. Is there somebody from Henry Mayo that could tell that, or
they may not want to tell that?
Why not have Carl on camera telling that? He has a way better memory. Yeah, for sure. Oh, I wish I could remember that. But yeah, going back to lots of drills, right?
Yeah, a lot of the drills were good.
Yeah.
The community, aside from fires and major stuff, the community was without water for quite a long time. How did the city deal with that?
Well, you know the answer to that. So back then, there was this big brouhaha, for lack of a better, between the city and the county. And the city of Santa Clarita was the center of the Santa Clarita Valley, surrounded by unincorporated county area. And there was this constant batting of heads over jurisdiction, over a myriad of things. And at the time, Stevenson Ranch, as it is to this day, is not a part of the city of Santa Clarita. So you have these different jurisdictions that are coming together for this emergency. But you have the city manager of the city of Santa Clarita who's in charge of getting the city restored. And so he chose to take a total view rather than a myopic view of just the city. And he looked at what was going on and he realized that Stevenson Ranch was indeed the hardest hit area of the Santa Clarita Valley without water. And so he used all his magic city manager powers to get us bottled water. And the very first pallets of bottled water went to Stevenson Ranch because their need was much greater than the rest of the city. You would think he would take fire for that, take care of your own. This is your city, but he did not. People were amazed, and there was a definite shift, a transformation of how that was viewed at the time. And to his credit, it was the right decision.
And the city brought in truckloads of bottled water and then had it stationed throughout the area.
Right. So one of the things you have to remember back in '94 is there was no internet, there was no social media. And so you look at, okay, how are we going to communicate? And no power, right? No gas, no power. How are we going to communicate with this huge city of Santa Clarita, all the people, all the neighborhoods? And so what we did is we used the fire department. And we used the fire trucks to go out into the neighborhoods to not only deliver pallets of water to neighborhoods, but also to deliver information. And I can distinctly remember creating flyers, running them off on a small Xerox machine that was in our operations center to give to the fire trucks so that they would have information to hand out. Things that people needed to know day to day. Okay, we're still in the water. We don't know when the power is going to get on. All the things that people needed to know, and that was how we communicated with people. And they came out to the fire trucks thinking they were just going to get the water, but they also got the information. But that's how we distributed water and information back then.
Yeah, and of course, on the radio station.
Well, we did have the radio station, which, everything comes full circle. So definitely the radio station was huge for getting information out there on a minute-by-minute basis. I shouldn't have skipped over that. But from the city, I was the spokesperson. And so my responsibility was to be in constant contact with the radio station. And the radio station was a godsend at the time to get information out.
I've got a fun story with the water, and maybe you can remember it in no words. But back then, we had 5 different water agencies, retailers, and one, Valencia Water, had gotten themselves cleared ahead of time. But the way the streets were divided, you could have Valencia Water
one side, yeah. I do remember that.
The head of Valencia Water Company had such an ego, he wanted to get the word out that his water was drinkable when all the others weren't drinkable. And the city, I was dealing with Adele at the time. Yep. Adele said, we don't want to put out that it's drinkable because people would have the wrong thing. So he would come pounding on the door at the radio station, wanting to go on the air. We wouldn't let him on the air. And then finally in those days, you mimeographed stuff. He mimeographed a note to give out to every customer. So people on one side of Soledad.
Yep, I remember. I won't repeat his name, but what was his name? You don't remember? What did he look like?
He was big guy. I'd have to look it up. I can think of it.
So Mauricio Garnados, Dan Masnada.
It was
big guy, older, bully, and then he became CLWA. I know who you're talking about. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah, so jurisdiction-wise, there was a lot of issue with who was in charge of what. And we, at the time, had 4 or 5 different water agencies. You had the gas company, you had electric. And so we wanted to make sure that we were using a consistent message. And that's what the Emergency Operations Center was for, was we had 2 meetings a day with all of the stakeholders. So all of the utilities, emergency service, the hospital, the college, media. We did 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. so that we were giving regular updates and everybody was on the same page. And pretty much that worked very well. In terms of the water, it was not safe to drink for all of Santa Clarita. And so we still had a boil water order going on. As I recall, one of the water agencies did get the all clear for their water, but because of the nature of customers, you could literally have one side of the street with one agency and the other side of the street with another water agency served by them. And you wouldn't know which was good and which was bad. And so we made the decision to have everybody stay under a boil order, just for safety and continuity, and so people wouldn't be so confused.
When in the stages of the earthquake did the city get red tagged? City Hall.
I don't remember exactly, but it was not long after the actual quake that City Hall was inspected, as were all the bridges and roads. I mean, that was a big effort. And it was discovered that indeed the integrity of the building had been compromised. And so the city, shortly after the quake, was what we call red tagged. And so what we did is we moved everything middle of January, end of January, out into the parking lot of City Hall. And it was cold. I remember that, being under tents, half tents, for hours and hours on end working, and it was chilly. I mean, it was snowing, but it was cold, and that made it all the more difficult as well, dealing with all the things that had to be dealt with. But people really just dug in and did what they had to do. It was a miracle that we got through as well as we did.
One of the challenges for Santa Clarita, well, two of the challenges. One is the rest of the media didn't cover anything in Santa Clarita because all the drama was down in Northridge. So other than the 514 going down, that was all they covered, when Santa Clarita probably had more dollar damage, more red tags than anywhere else. And then we had a long time, it's like 6 months till they got the 514 back up to deal with the recovery. So it really transitioned from the shock of the initial quake to 4, 5, 6 months of constant information that needed.
Yep. So much. Very true. So the aftermath of the quake was very interesting. If you've been in Santa Clarita at all, you know that our lifeline to Los Angeles is the 514 interchange. And that went down in the quake. That was out of commission. Well, what that did was it made the Metrolink very valuable. And we literally went from a few hundred riders per day on the Metrolink to several thousand, because people needed to get to work, and just couldn't accommodate. I remember one stat, it was like 26,000 people were riding the Metrolink from Santa Clarita to get into LA, to get into the Valley where they needed to work. So the city responded by adding a new Metrolink station stop, so that the center one in the center of the city, next to the Speedway, wasn't as impacted. And that was out in Canyon Country. That one's still there today. What it looks like today is very different than what it looked like. Our director of engineering, they literally built that thing in, I want to say, weeks, not even months, but weeks. And I remember having a grand opening celebration to celebrate it. We did that so that we could get some coverage of, hey, you don't have to go to the Metrolink in the center of the city. You folks in Canyon Country, you can go to the Via Princesa one, and doing a media event out there. And it was pouring torrential rains. And I had an umbrella that just did one of those where it, upside down and flew out of my hand. And but we did that opening anyway. And so people used the Metrolink to get out. It was just a change in the way of life, of what people had to deal with in the aftermath of the quake.
Because there'd be a 5 or 6 hour drive down there, so a lot of people would go down on a early 3 a.m. on Monday morning, stay down there with a friend or in a motel, and then come back Friday night. That was life for people.
Yeah, it was very difficult without the 514 interchange to navigate getting to work if you were working in the Valley or in Los Angeles, anywhere outside of the Santa Clarita Valley. And it demonstrated, how important that link was. People felt isolated here. It was a very difficult time.
Metrolink had only been around a couple of years.
Yeah, The Metrolink was new, and we were having trouble building ridership. People, for whatever reason, were not hot to sit on a train for a couple hours. They'd rather sit in their car. So if anything, this introduced people to the Metrolink, and they got a chance to see what that was all about.
One of the biggest challenges during the recovery was that while they were rebuilding the 514, Caltrans constantly changed the intersections. They were checking intersections, so the surface traffic was constantly changing. And we, as the radio station, were giving out the latest information. In fact, we had I keep talking about cell phones. Cell phone was the size of the table, and Frontier Toyota had given us a car, and his entire job was to drive around surface streets during morning and afternoon.
Oh my God!
Traffic.
Yeah.
And I think it was before the city had actual cameras up.
Oh yeah.
So we would know from listeners faster than the city.
Yep.
Caltrans changed something.
Absolutely.
Sure.
I do remember that. So kids, before there was Waze and different navigations on your phone, we had to go by the radio station to know what was open and what wasn't. And so it was very customary in the morning if you were commuting anywhere, to turn on your radio station to find out what was the latest in terms of what roads were closed, what roads were open. And back then we were still very much at a loss for the need of roads. We did not have the Cross Valley connector. We had Soledad Canyon Road. We had Lyons. I mean, we did not have a series of a grid layout like San Fernando Valley does. And so streets were impacted. People were cutting through neighborhoods, and we would get calls about that. They're cutting through my neighborhood. It's not safe for my kids. They're speeding. I mean, that went on and on and on. People just trying to get to work, just trying to get where they need to go. So we needed a lot of grace during that period. A lot of patience with what was happening. It was difficult.
And if I remember, when you had to manually change, like you couldn't do it all.
Yeah. So now we have more roads, for one thing, but we also have the ability to remotely adjust the lights on the street light signals. So red, green, yellow. We could do those now. Just with the flick of a switch, but back then it was a manual process. And so as things changed, as roads got impacted that weren't impacted before, we had to stay on top of all of that.
You, like all of us, were running on adrenaline for quite some time. Talk about that.
Yeah, it was tough. I was glad I was younger back then. But it was definitely a 24/7 job. There were no days off. We, like the fire department and the police department, we put our folks on 12 on 12. So you got some rest. I don't feel like I got any rest, but I do remember one incident where in the middle of all of this, I needed an emergency root canal. And Carl Goldman, the owner of the radio station, insisted that I take my phone with me, my giant brick phone, into the dentist office. And I couldn't talk. I mean, there was nothing I could do. So I was out of communication for 3-4 hours, and he was not happy about that. I do remember that very vividly, but it was constant that we were needing to provide information, because this was, the newspaper would come out, but it would be, the next day, and they were publishing everything at that time. Minute by minute information that people needed. And so the radio station really was a lifeline for people.
We discovered early on was not only was the radio station a lifeline for information, but emotionally. Talk about the emotional side.
So one of the things that we did that I'm very proud of, actually, is we set up a room with phones with a City Hall hotline, for lack of a better. You could report things, you could call to discuss issues, and we did a lot of hand-holding. There's, as I remember, 10 or 12, mostly ladies, that were in that room, and I had a giant chalkboard set up in front of them so that I could post new information for them, so they could just glance up and see it, and be able to give that information to people on the phone. But it was a busy room. I think we had a different name for it at the time, which escapes me at the moment. But you could call and talk to somebody in charge to find out what you needed to know, but also just to get some reassurance that HICS was in charge, that things were being done, and it might not be moving as fast as you wanted, but it was moving. And I know the radio station did a lot of that as well. Just people were scared. It was a very, very scary time. But I also remember people pulling together. You would drive through neighborhoods and, without electricity, guess what? There was no freezers and refrigerators. So people would haul their stuff out, set up their barbecue on the front lawn and just have a giant barbecue because the food was going bad anyway. And whole neighborhoods would be out enjoying each other's company and, just sort of talking about what was going on, but it was a comfort for them as well. And so that's part of the point of view that I saw.
We put in pastors early on during the whole faith thing without it really being religious, more of an emotional connection, and that really took off as well.
Can I cut really quick? Just need to do a quick technical thing here. Make sure I'm synced up.
Are we not syncing?
All right, good.
The hospital had to handle a lot of stuff too. What was the relationship with the hospital and the city?
The relationship with the hospital and the city was very good, just like it was with the utilities and the college. It was definitely a time to pull together, to work together, figure out what needed to be done, and just get it done. So I don't remember any specific issues at all where we said, gosh, we wish, this person would do this or this agency would do that. Everybody was very willing to do what needed to be done.
In fact, at the command center at the city, you had not just city people, but who did you have?
We, at the so the Emergency Operations Center, that wasn't City Hall, then it ended up being in the parking lot, and then we eventually moved down the road 4 or 5 miles to a facility that is now our activities center, but at the time was an old building. We had all the entities in the Emergency Operations Center. We had County Fire, we had police, we had CHP, the hospital, Henry Mayo, College of the Canyons, even New Holland and Farm. They're a big player in the community. We had media in and out. Everything was open. You could come in and see what was going on, watch people work. I remember as we were in the parking lot at City Hall, people would drive by and honk their horn and wave and just be very, very encouraging. In a way, it was really a cool thing that people could see, oh yeah, the City Hall got red tag. See, they're out in the parking lot. You could drive by and see them working. And that was huge for people to know that.
And the Red Cross was very active too.
Red Cross was another one that was involved. All the nonprofit agencies that had any kind of Lark Ranch, they were helpful with helping transport people. I mean, it was definitely, I can't think of a nonprofit or an agency or an entity that was not helpful in the aftermath of the quake.
In fact, I remember one instance we were involved with where early on there was not just a water shortage, there was a diaper shortage.
Oh, jeez.
And a severe diaper shortage. And the Red Cross coordinated with us, and we announced that there was a diaper shortage. So and we used the Red Cross had a truck parked behind their building over by where the old Kmart was, and they would, we got announced that there was a diaper shortage, and that show how the community got together. Within 30 minutes, they had a truckload full of diapers from people donating diapers.
It was an amazing time. You would think that people would hunker down and protect their own, and it wasn't like that at all. People were willing to share. They were willing to help. They were doing anything they could to help their neighbor and the community, and they were appreciative of what was being done. I have to say that was a surprise. You would think that they would be angry, but they were not. They saw how hard we were working, and we were, and they were appreciative of it.
What do you think the biggest challenge was for you personally during the whole recovery period?
2 different times for me. So the aftermath of the quake, the weeks just after the quake, just were a blur. It was about getting information out. It was about making sure that people had what they needed. It was all hands on deck. And then after a couple of months, it went into the rebuild period. And that was a little bit different. because much like the beginning of cityhood, where it was a great big party and everyone was happy, you sort of had the aftermath where the exhilaration of getting through it wore off, and then it was kind of like, so when are we going to get this fixed? When is the interchange going to be open? When? And keeping people informed, I found, was the best way to deal with that. And so that no amount of information was too much information. We hit them in every way we could. We had direct mail, you name it, we did it. We used the media, door hangers, flyers, whatever we could to inform people, and that really made all the difference. So all of what I call my tools in the toolbox were put to good use.
You missed out on skywriting, though.
Oh gosh, that was on there. I don't think we ever pulled the trigger on that, though, did we? No, we did. We had a brainstorming of how we could inform people, and as a joke, skywriting came up. But we realized we had more messaging than we had room in the sky there, so that went off. But everything was on the table in terms of, how do we notify people? We used bridge banners at the time, bus shelter advertising at the time, things that are still used today. Wish we had the internet and social media back then. That would have been huge.
It would have been a whole different ballgame.
Oh yeah.
With that, you and I lost a dear friend in Adele.
Yes.
Why don't you re-establish that and share some thoughts about Adele during that time?
I will. So Adele McPherson was this amazing British lady who served as the city's emergency coordinator, and that was her title at the time. And she did a great job of checking all the boxes for state and federal requirements that the city needed to fulfill for emergency preparedness. And she's the one that led us on drills and tabletop exercises. And we had small incidents up until then. And then the quake hit. And then we really discovered who Adele McPherson was. And pretty much the number one person at City Hall and in the community was Adele McPherson. She was the go-to person. She was calm under pressure. She never raised her voice. She always had an answer for you. May not have been the one you wanted. She was in the weeds and big picture all at the same time. She was a huge confidant to the city manager, George Carvalho, and the assistant city manager, Ken Polskamp, at the time. And I remember a fun incident where George promoted her in the middle of everything. He said, "You are now the emergency manager. You're not a coordinator anymore." And so she got a little bump up in pay. And she was happy, but it was like, we got to get through this. But she was amazing in what she brought to the table. And I don't think I have known an emergency operations professional before her or since that was as terrific as Adele McPherson was.
Good. That was good. The city staff was totally hands-on. To share the role the city council played and talk about that a bit.
City council was interesting, and there's something to be said for the right people at the right time. George Pedersen was our mayor, and he was the right guy for the right time. He had a personality that was welcoming and professional, and so when we had people in from Washington, send George to meet the plane and take him around, and we knew that he would be fine. He wasn't going to step out of line or say something he shouldn't or be flip or unprofessional. He was fantastic in that role, and funny all at the same time. I really appreciated George Pedersen, and you knew if he was around, he was a quiet man, but he was there and in a supportive role. Another one that comes to mind is Carl Boyer. I didn't see much of Carl because Carl decided that his role was to be out with the community. And so at the time, people were afraid to go back in their homes. We had tent city in our parks. And I especially remember Newhall Park, just a sea of tents. Everybody didn't want to go in their home. A lot of people didn't want to go back to their home. It was scary. Whether or not it was red tagged, it was scary. And so they set up tents, and Carl was out there walking amongst them, bringing water, whatever he could do. And I think that meant a lot to him to be out there with people. Then we had another council member who decided this would be a good time to take a junket to out of the country. She didn't make it back. She did not get reelected. And I believe in my heart it was largely in part to her lack of hands-on help during the quake. But the others were fantastic. They were supportive of staff. We had a lot of things that had to go through the city council, mandates and legal stuff, and they were, always ready to do an emergency meeting to make sure that we could move forward and get what we needed.
It's a good thing you didn't have Tim Ben as mayor.
Praise the Lord. There was no Tim Ben Boydston.
It's on the record now.
Thank you. And I'm happy if you use it.
Let's jump in and we'll come back to a couple things. After the earthquake and after the 5 and 14 was rebuilt, and we're back to semblance of normalcy, what do you think the staff learned from that, and what were put into place because of the earthquake? What things did you implement after that?
In the aftermath of the quake, one of the things that comes to mind that was different was all of the building codes. I mean, pretty much it was a complete turnover of building codes. And at the time, our building official was Ruben Barrera, and he had his hands full. Him and his team going out and inspecting. But statewide, we saw a complete change in the building codes. And the word rebar, I think, is a lot more used in the codes than it used to be. So that was a big change for the city to this day. I think that the staff really matured over that period. We had a young staff. This was 1994. The city was, not even 8-10 years old yet. And so we had a young staff, both in age and just in being at the city. Many who had never worked for a city, and so they sort of were forged in fire with this event. And I think it made everybody better and stronger. They did not rest on their laurels. We continue to have emergency drills, tabletop exercises to fine-tune our craft. And when I left the city at that time, I left the city in 2016, I personally had been the communications manager for 11 federally declared disasters with the city of Santa Clarita, of which the Northridge quake was one. So I think we all got really good at dealing with an emergency or two or three.
You became the poster child.
I did.
One of the things that happened early on in the radio, I think, was a good stopgap for it, and so was the city, was a lot of con artists, a lot of fly-by-night stuff. Yeah. So 3 things that come to mind that I'd like you to comment on. One is, first of all, contractors that would knock on the door. There was a second incident where on the west side, someone posed as a gas company inspector to get into the houses, and so the city issued, or the gas company then issued tags for everybody because they had a lot of managers going in to turn gas back on. And then there was a store on Bouquet, a mini mart gas station that was selling water for $7 a bottle, and that lasted about 2 minutes as soon as we got on the air. And then they pleaded with us that they were going to change their ways and such. So those are 3 things I saw. Maybe you can comment on those, or whatever you saw. You would have seen a lot more.
So in addition to dealing with rebuilding our city and getting utilities and such back online, getting roads built, we had to deal with flim-flam artists. Much like the aftermath of COVID, which lasted 2 years, we saw incidents of people taking advantage of others. And so what we did is we worked very closely with our chief of police, the police department, the sheriff's department, to make sure that we were alerting people. And this is where the media came in. They were fantastic with helping to get information out. These people, they suffered so much. Some of them, were looking at block walls that had fallen down, and you have someone knock on your door and says, me and my guys can clean that up for you in no time. All we need is a down payment, and then you'd never see them again. And so these poor people, these unsuspecting people, lost again. And so we were very vigilant about alerting people to scams, letting them know that there was a process, and if they even doubted it at all, we gave them a number to call, Better Business Bureau, contractors associations that they could check with. Again, no internet, so you had to make phone calls and such to find out those things. So just being vigilant and being aware of those things. We asked people to call us if they felt that was happening to them, and so we got a lot of calls about that. But the Sheriff's Department did a fantastic job of helping to educate and respond to those situations.
And then they talk about a couple of the retailers who scalped for a while?
Well, everybody wants to make a buck, and while you had some retailers that were willing to stay open during the aftermath of the quake and provide necessities to people, you had others that were scalping. And totally not cool, not okay. This is not what Santa Clarita was about. It's not the Santa Clarita way to do that. So they sometimes needed a little talking to, and they got it.
FEMA stepped in.
FEMA did.
Share the whole cycle of FEMA.
Oh gosh, give me some things you want to hear about, because I'm not sure I know what you want to hear.
FEMA stepped in, and they were here for a number of months. You opened
Helping
up,
individuals.
yeah, helping individuals, and you opened up a area, I think over by the activity center, if I remember, in that building.
Yes, where we were.
Where FEMA was
FEMA.
headquartered
Yep.
there. So why don't you talk about that a little bit?
So the Federal Emergency Management Association, better known as FEMA, was boots on the ground, meeting individually with residents to try and help them get some money to help pay for repairs that were not covered by insurance. Some people just didn't have insurance, or didn't have enough, or didn't have the right insurance. And so while we were in a temporary building awaiting the refurbishment of City Hall, we had rented this building that we did not own at the time. We now own. Our city actually owns it. But we allowed FEMA to come in and have a space there where they could provide information to people, to meet with them one-on-one, to help them get through the aftermath, the rebuild.
Good. That's it, I think.
Okay.
Could I go back and do a couple little color
You do
things?
whatever you want. You want me to say no more Tim Ben ever?
Yeah.
I'm happy to say that again.
Tell me how you really
Joe
feel.
Klagic, too.
It was Klagic.
It
Remember,
was
she got
Klagic,
that
yeah.
trash
Yeah.
junket to Tahiti,
That's right.
and she left.
That's right.
She didn't make it back. She didn't.
So,
In between-
some
Yes,
of the
sorry.
stuff,
In between pajama parties.
some of the stuff you've already kind of touched on.
Uh-huh.
I just want to get a little bit more detail. So it sounds, luckily, you didn't really get the brunt force of feeling the quake itself.
Oh, at my house?
Yeah.
Yeah, true that.
But you started to actually see the actual destruction. Could you tell us, like, describe some of the things that you were actually seeing on your way to work?
Oh, yeah, sure. So after the quake, I'm on my way in a car traveling from Canyon Country westbound on Soledad Canyon, and everywhere I looked, it seemed like it looked like a war zone. It looked like somebody had bombed Santa Clarita. Little fires everywhere. There were downed walls, so block walls that were 4, 5, 6, 10 feet tall, just down, and so that made for rubble in the streets. In some instances, there were down power lines, and so you definitely want to go around those. It was scary. It was unbelievable that in such a short time that our city could be transformed into literally a war zone.
It was like you were on a movie set.
It was like you're on a movie set, yeah, for sure.
And so, what was going through your mind as you're starting to see all these things going into work? Are you stressing out about your own what is coming and what you have to?
You know,
to do?
I was, how old was I? Let's see, 20, 94, 61, 70, 91. So I was 33 years old at the time. I had been a professional public relations, media, communications person for probably 8 or 9 years. My background was I had worked in a hospital, St. Joseph Medical Center in Burbank for 5 years, smaller hospital before that, came to Santa Clarita. So I had some experience under my belt. But I cannot imagine any experience or education I would have had to prepare me for what I was about to face as a PIO, public information officer, communications professional. And so much of that is common sense. So much of that is relying on relationships that were built over the years. So much of that was figuring it out. And that's my favorite part of the job anyway, is figuring out how to solve a problem, how to fix something with communications. So I feel like I had to use all the tools in the toolbox, all my skills, and a few I didn't have, to get through what was definitely one of the highlights of my career, but also one of the most challenging things I've ever done. Is that what you wanted?
Yeah,
Okay, good.
absolutely. When did the city declare a state of emergency?
So one of the first acts of the Santa Clarita City Council in the aftermath of the earthquake was to officially declare the city of Santa Clarita an emergency. And what that did is it availed us to state and federal help that we wouldn't otherwise have.
Awesome. And then could you tell me when the city actually started to lose resources? Was it directly as a result of the
It was,
earthquake?
yeah.
So as soon as the earthquake hit, no
Yeah.
more gas, no more electricity.
So as a result of the quake, we immediately lost power. So no electric, no gas. We were told not to use the water because it wasn't safe, and there was a boil order on. And so you went literally from 1 minute to the next of not having resources that you had the day before. And this was citywide. This was valley-wide. In some cases, the epicenter of the Northridge earthquake being Northridge, all throughout the community surrounding it. So very scary time.
I also remember the phone, there was self-service, didn't exist for most people, but the landlines wouldn't work for days and days within California. So we would have to, so Ryan, our oldest, at that time he was 3, 4, whatever, he was with our in-laws down in Northridge.
Oh boy.
We couldn't get to him for a day and a half.
Oh boy.
But the only way to communicate was we had to call our Transtar corporate headquarters in New York. They would call Gene and Bruce's house, and we couldn't communicate directly.
Yep, I do remember something on that. So in addition to utilities being down, one of those is the telephone. And so, of course, people in the epicenter of the earthquake want to communicate with people outside the epicenter, and the phones were down. One of the tools in the toolbox we use, and I don't know that we've used it before or since, is the ham radio operators. And we brought them into City Hall to use the airwaves so that we could communicate. And that was novel at the time, and it's probably novel now to think about using, in 1994 to use ham radio operators. And then, of course, the unreliable cell phones, the towers that existed were minimal because it was such a new thing, and they were jammed, so that was also unreliable.
And we had a ham radio operator at the radio station
Yes.
for many days.
And so could you tell me, since you guys have no electricity, actually bringing in the generators and, just trying to get up and running again?
Yeah. So when we were in City Hall, and that was where our emergency operations center was, we had generators that we used to power whatever we needed. And so when we moved out into the parking lot, we just moved those generators out into the parking lot. And that's what we used for power, to regenerate the cell phones, to operate the little Xerox machines, whatever it is we needed. That's what we had. It was the generators to do that. And thank goodness that we had them, because otherwise I don't know how we would power anything.
Could you speak about the evacuation of I think it's called the Green Briere mobile homes?
Greenbrier. Greenbrier.
There were a bunch of mobile homes that
Yeah, there were. I'm trying to remember.
They had gas problems.
That must have been it.
Yeah, gas leaks.
Yeah, so the Red Cross was instrumental in setting up Red Cross stations. I believe they were, gosh, I don't remember. Do you remember?
They had one
I want to say auditorium, but that doesn't sound right.
No, they had one in one of the gyms.
Gymnasiums, yeah. Okay.
Gym, and they had one in their main. They had a building next to Kmart, so they had one.
Right.
They didn't have an evacuation.
No.
They had,
Yeah, I'm trying to remember where we set up. It might have been in the park, Newhall Park. So the Red Cross had stations that they'd set up for evacuees, and one group of evacuees were mobile home parks, specifically the Greenbrier mobile home park had to be evacuated because of a gas leak there. And you got to remember, in mobile home parks, you've got elderly, you got people that don't get around like they used to. And it was very difficult and very scary for them to leave their homes, for one thing, and then have to go to a Red Cross shelter. So that was just a whole nother element that was brought to bear with the aftermath of the quake.
Could you talk about what was, I think it's called Tent City?
Tent City, that was the park.
What was
Yeah.
Tent City and what was it used for?
Yeah. So, as mentioned before, I guess I shouldn't say that because you're cutting. One of the things we saw in the aftermath of the quake was that people were fearful to go back into their homes. They weren't sure if they were really safe. The inspectors were going around and inspecting as fast as they could. We brought in inspectors to help with that. But some people, their homes hadn't been inspected and they weren't sure if they were safe. And so they decided that it would be a better idea to go and pitch a tent in the park. And so we had what we called at the time Tent City. I specifically remember Newhall Park because it's a big park, flat, grassy area, and people just pitched a tent and we let them. We supported them. That's what that needed to happen at the time. They were fearful to go into their homes, and so Tent City was where our assistant city manager, Ken Pulskamp, I remember, and Councilmember Carl Boyer spent a whole lot of time helping people figuring out, pitching a tent and getting the things that they needed and, connecting them with services, connecting them with inspectors for their home. Some had damage they needed to deal with. And so Tent City just became this area where people could feel safe in the aftermath of the quake.
At some point, the National Guard actually arrives with some fresh drinking water.
We already covered that. I just didn't say National Guard. Do you want me to redo that with the word National Guard in it?
Oh, so it's this the FEMA?
Well, no, it was not FEMA. It was the brought truckloads of water.
Yeah, that we mentioned earlier.
And there
I
was
could redo it if you want with the word National. Okay.
No, it's all good.
I don't remember it being National Guard, but it
Yeah.
probably was because that's where I said George did his magic to get it, and that was the
I
National
think
Guard.
it was
Yeah.
the National Guard. now that
Because
you
I've already gone through some archival photos.
Oh,
and
good.
One of them was National Guard.
Yeah.
and fresh
So when I
drinking
talk
water.
about George doing his magic to get it, I could redo that with the National Guard if you want.
Oh yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Let's do that.
So one of the things that was of great need was water because the water was shut off. People needed drinking water. And our city manager, George Carvalho, did his magic and contacted the National Guard who showed up with truckloads of water, which were dispersed throughout the community, but very first to the Stevenson Ranch community because they had the greatest need at the time. Even though Stevenson Ranch was outside the city, our city manager, who was the Emergency Operations Center manager for the community, decided that he would go with who needed it the most. And it turns out that that's where it was needed. They were the hardest hit. Stevenson Ranch area was the hardest hit. So that National Guard water was very welcome and very helpful.
And add in one line that I remember is they had to bring the National Guard in from Bakersfield because none had come in from LA.
Oh my gosh. Good Lord.
Good.
Do you want me to add that?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things about the National Guard is because the 14.5 connection was down, they had to bring the National Guard in from Bakersfield to bring the water to Santa Clarita.
So you started to talk about racing to get inspections done. I actually found a record that 800 inspections were being done per day.
Isn't that amazing?
could
Yeah.
you
Okay,
comment
good.
on
I'm
that
glad
one?
you remember the number because I don't. 30 years. So inspections were a big deal. Everybody wanted their home inspected, whether they had visible damage or not, because they didn't know. They weren't sure. And so we had a handful of inspectors on the city staff. And what I remember is we brought in inspectors from outside the area, what we called contract inspectors, to make sure that there was a faster pace of getting inspections. And I believe at the height of it, we were doing 800 inspections per day in the community, which went a long way to help people feel safer if they could go back in their home or not go back in their home and start the ball rolling for the rehab that needed to happen.
All right, and then last one that I have for you is, do you believe Santa Clarita is prepared if this were to happen again?
So fast forward to January 2024, where it's 30 years post-earthquake. I have had the privilege of supporting cities and counties throughout the state in my consulting career post-Santa Clarita, and I have never seen a city that is as prepared as the city of Santa Clarita. They take emergency operations and preparation and practice very seriously. They learn their lessons from the early days of being prepared and have not rested on their laurels and continue to be a very well-prepared city.
Oh, actually, one more. Sorry, I'm going to
Okay,
jump right
no, you're
back.
good.
So one thing I found incredible was that the earthquake happens, there's all this destruction, devastation, and then the weather hits you with rain.
And we're out in tents in the parking lot.
So could you comment how it's just like it's one hit right after
Yeah.
the other?
So once City Hall was red tagged and we found ourselves under tents in the parking lot of City Hall, you have to remember it's the end of January, beginning of February, and it's the rainy season in Santa Clarita. And yes, we were hit with rain. So it really did feel like one thing after another, where we're trying to get through the aftermath of the quake, and then we've got weather to deal with, and all the little things each and every day that happen. But it would have been nice not to have rain.
Yeah, I can remember pulling up in the truck nearby, going when you were in tents out there, and it was just pouring down sheets. Yeah, pretty amazing.
Carl was always like, I can be a bitch. Like, Carl's never. He was always nice and always polite and always friendly no matter what was going on. I love that about him.
Unless you needed to do a root canal.
Yeah.
Unless you need to do a root canal. Then it was like, come on.
I think that's all for me.
All right.
Any other things?
Thank you.
Gosh, this is going to